And we are recording. So Skip, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Richard. Really pleased to be able to at least connect with all of you virtually. It was a nice pivot on the part of the organizers, and I'm pleased that they're interested in proceeding with the content. Just by way of a little bit of background, the association I work for, the Technology Association of Oregon, is an organization that really sits at the intersection of public, private, and educational sectors. And we serve as kind of a bridge, helping to grow a world-class, inclusive, innovation-based economy here in the Northwest. And ideally, that economy is powered by tech. And so day to day, we do a lot of work to help strengthen the tech industry and connect the subject matter experts and thought leaders and companies within that industry to opportunities to improve government, improve the local communities in which those companies and their employees are located. And so it really puts us in an interesting vantage point, given a lot of our work, project-wise, brings together those diverse sectors. And not surprisingly, we're seeing a lot of both collision points as well as points of collaboration that involve data. And when the organizers of this conference approached me many months ago and shared with me the topic at the time, which was resiliency in GIS, I was like, oh, that's awesome. You know, not enough people are talking about what makes a resilient organization or a resilient region. And there's some fascinating economic research that's gone on in recent years, looking at different ways that regions can be essentially disruptors themselves. In other words, the idea that if you've got the public, private, and academic sectors all working from the same, you great things. You can be creative, you can build new models of what it looks like to live and work in a particular area. And there's also a lot of opportunities to think about what are the identities and what are the assets that reside here in Oregon and the greater Northwest. And I would say that as a region, we're still kind of becoming whatever it is that we're going to become, right? We're evolving, we're still maturing. And so I thought it was a great topic. And then, of course, the organizers seemed remarkably prescient as we now find ourselves in a crisis that has really upended a lot of assumptions and things that we took as common or normal. And so this topic of resilience or resiliency is really current and top of mind for a lot of the different organizations we work with. And really data and GIS in particular as a practice is something that I think is going to be a hugely important part of both how we respond to the crisis and how we ultimately recover. So I'm going to start with this presentation by reviewing some of the more current trends that we're seeing as it relates to the COVID-19 crisis and what that means for the GIS community and the role that it's playing. And then also talk a little bit about some of the things that we're seeing state, local, and even national governments do to kind of implement new models, new frameworks that really help them to leverage additional capabilities, technology, data, expertise, in both addressing crises such as the COVID-19 crisis, but also in how they respond to a whole wide variety of civic challenges. And then finally, we'll talk about some different frameworks that I think, at least my humble opinion, could helpfully move some of this work forward in a way that brings more communities together. And even in a period of resource constraints, some really positive outcomes can be achieved. So we started with, I thought it'd be good to define resilience. And so it's really about being able to recover quickly from difficulties, having a certain toughness and elasticity to systems, networks, institutions. And as we, let's see here, I'm having some issues advancing. Just bear with me a moment. I'm going to reset this. So as we think about the COVID-19 crisis, I thought this dashboard was particularly interesting in the sense that we have a lot of member companies that we're working with that are doing all sorts of interesting things, whether it's Esri or Google or some smaller startups. And this is a local company that leveraged some of the public data that they have access to at the county level, state by state, to look at a daily sort of makeup of what exactly is happening with all the different coronavirus cases. And it's interactive, so you can drill into different areas, look at the data. But I think what's more important and more interesting in the context of the COVID-19 crisis is really what are some of the things that we need to do now to make sure that we're both responsive to additional outbreaks or surges, and then to also track and test where people who've been infected came into contact with others, essentially contact tracing. And so again, there's huge opportunities here for data practitioners in the GIS community and helping to provide solutions and insight and trying to help communities get a handle on outbreaks as they occur. And most of the conventional wisdom is such that we're going to be experiencing waves of this into the near and potentially midterm. And so this was a snapshot I took just this morning from an article in the New York Times that talks about some of the contact tracing that is now underway. And they found that a lot of the sort of cases in small communities as well as other sort of hotspots really originated in New York, which was the epicenter in the United States for quite some time and still is one of the hotspots. And not surprisingly, with more connections and more points of travel between New York and other communities, it spread pretty quickly. And in Oregon, crisis and potentially reopen the economy and move it again, obviously data is super important to this conversation. And so, as the governor is trying to figure out how are different hospitalizations and infections and deaths trending, access to real-time data and the ability to test and trace people really quickly is hugely important. And about 6 days ago or so, there was some coverage in local media announcing that Oregon Health Authority and OHSU and the governor's office had come together to essentially put together a research study with about 100,000 randomly selected Oregonians. And the idea was that those Oregonians would voluntarily provide data that could be used to help inform decision-making at a variety of different governmental levels. And the idea was, to be more responsive and agile and getting people back to school and work quicker. And the problem is that if you remove some of the sanctions too quickly, there's a risk that, there's additional spikes. And so the study looked at some different ways to collect the data, being mindful of the state's ethnic and geographically diverse populations. And the idea was that they'd be tracking some of the COVID-19 symptoms, including monitoring temperature on a daily basis for a period of 12 months. And the idea was the data would be collected in real time using things like smart devices, smart thermometers, and including the distribution of home test kits. And so this sample size would be instructive for state policymakers as they're trying to adjust in real time some of the restrictions and other policies that they're looking to impose to help kind of squelch some of these outbreaks at their cause. And the other interesting thing is that there's going to be an opportunity, I think, in terms of results, to really look at the relationship between kind of easing the distancing measures and then the resurgence of COVID-19 transmission. So we're kind of in a new environment in dealing with this pandemic. And so the more data points that can be collected, obviously, the better the opportunity for policymakers to make a more informed decision that impacts the broader population based initially on this sample. And the idea of being able to identify quickly emerging virus hotspots is one of the goals of this study. And there's obviously going to be a special attention paid to high-risk populations and underserved communities to make sure no one's left out and that the most vulnerable are protected. Now, obviously, those are great aspirational goals, but the challenge in all of this is, of course, what are some of the things that are likely going to be raised when it comes to data privacy? And in all of this work, there's a lot of concern and attention now being paid to data privacy rights, who's collecting the data, who has control over it, what does consent look like, and then what are the ultimate uses to which the data is being put and by whom. And a lot of countries are grappling with this. You had Europe with GDPR a couple of years ago. There hasn't been a federal initiative in the US, but individual states are now acting. And Oregon is likely to pass some legislation in 2021 around data privacy. And so in this context, it's a careful balance. The technology exists where we could potentially take a pretty invasive approach to get real-time data on individuals at a super granular level and be able to trace points of contact and everything else. Most people have mobile devices. It's pretty easy to get access to that data if consent is being given either by the companies that have it or by the individuals who supplied it in the first place. Now, those are all big ifs. And so in a country like China, those ifs are much smaller ifs. And in more authoritarian states, you have examples of countries opening up faster and imposing fewer requirements to protect data privacy. Now, in the United States, we obviously have a variety of different laws in place to protect some of those rights. And so there's going to be this careful balancing and tension inherent between leveraging technology to act quickly in the public interest while also protecting some of these ongoing data privacy rights to make sure they don't erode. And I think that what's interesting is as we start to think about the role of applications and other types of technology that could be developed for this, this article was an interesting one on the BBC that was talking about how the world is essentially for contact tracing. And there was sort of one that was a little bit more focused around, more of a centralized approach, and then another that was more decentralized. Now, the centralized model is used by the United Kingdom, and in that situation, all data is uploaded to a single server. It gives authorities a better view into where outbreaks are occurring, who's involved. At least that's what the proponents would argue. And then the decentralized model, which is used by Google, Apple, and an international consortium of different organizations, the data remains on the phone. So essentially, it's equivalent to edge computing. The idea with that conceptually is that with data remaining at the edge, it's more secure and you're able to provide better privacy, data privacy safeguards in place with no centralized control or security risks inherent in that. So this is an example, I think, of the tension between government and the private sector over the control of data. So what does the consumer think ultimately? I think that's going to be the real deciding factor here. Do they trust government? Do they trust the private sector? Which approach do they trust better inherently? And are they able to make an informed decision? In all of those questions, I think that there is an opportunity for government to play a trusted role. And I'll share in just a few minutes some examples of different ways that governments are doing that, stepping in and playing that trusted platform role. So another thing that's related to this, this decentralized versus centralized data trend really ties into another one that's related, which is around the decentralization of social networks. And there's been some recent treatment in the media about this in the sense that rather than the consolidation that we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years as it relates to social networks, we're seeing a trend, especially in younger generations, where there's more of an interest in using specific applications for specific groups that are affinity groups that you want to be a part of. And so if you're into gardening, you join an app that's specific, a community specific for gardening. If you're into cooking, same thing. And in that way, you're not trying to get access to your network of subject matter experts in gardening and having a bunch of people bombard you with thoughts around how they feel about the next political election and a bunch of advertising that's related to things not at all related to gardening. And so there's this shift moving away again to sort of this decentralized approach. Now that poses some issues when it comes to the collection of data at a large scale and being able to kind of wrestle with some of these interoperability issues. Now, obviously APIs can fix some of that, But as things become more decentralized and balkanized, I think there's going to be some issues around how exactly can that data best be utilized. Again, there's also privacy issues that kind of weigh in favor of greater decentralization. So all of these things are kind of coming to a head right now. Again, I think there are opportunities for government, we'll get to in a minute. So one of those areas that we're really paying close attention to is when it comes to smart health, there's obviously a big opportunity in the role of technology in responding to pandemics, but other types of healthcare needs, including preventative health. And we're seeing a lot of interplay between human factors and the physical and digital environments. And this is something that we're seeing just in the work we're doing here in Oregon between our smart cities activities on the one hand and digital health on the other, like legacy healthcare and Cambia healthcare, and arguably a lot of the athletic and outdoor companies in the area like Nike are really focused around preventative health and wellness and also the consumerization of healthcare. And with that focus, they're trying to reach people that are their patients or consumers in ways that are consistently engaging and to be able to collect information from them so that the companies can respond in real time, either to a health need or to some sort of factor that if they're able to provide information in return, that consumer or patient might change their behavior in a way that produces a positive, healthy outcome. And so the more data, the more open channels of communication, ostensibly the greater the opportunities for those organizations to make a positive impact at a large scale level when it comes to behavior change. So the individual behavior taken at the macro level produces really profound outcomes for communities. And what we're seeing too is that as the more rural areas occurs, there's potentially some opportunities for smaller communities, not just incredibly dense cities. And the thinking around that is that the density that was once a very attractive part of urban life is now being seen as a negative in the context of this pandemic. And rural communities might stand to benefit from that pandemic. And I think, there are examples like in Vermont where last year or so they launched an initiative where they'd pay an individual $10,000 to move there with a job and work remotely. And I think with the pandemic, we're seeing a big focus around the digital divide and needs on the part of people in rural communities, but also in urban areas that are underserved from broadband and wireless connectivity standpoint. And with that increased attention is coming increased investment from the public sector, specifically at the federal level. And so there are definitely opportunities there. You also have the private sector responding in kind where there's demand demonstrated, they're building out more networks. And so you could think about the digital divide incrementally getting closed there, but it also means that more people are being brought online and getting access, which means more data points and more opportunities to kind of bridge the digital divide in access, but also in an understanding of what those folks in areas that are underserved or more rural might need, and also the opportunities for those folks to access critical services, education, jobs, government services. And so I think that as we look at the pandemic, there's also some other issues, which is early on in the spread of the COVID-19 virus, it was happening mostly in dense urban areas. But now what we're seeing many weeks later is that it's also impacting smaller communities. And so they're not immune from the spread, even though they have smaller populations. And so I think it's an open question. So in order to preserve our ability to connect across geographies, it really increasingly depends on really accurate real-time GIS data. So can we quickly respond, trace, and isolate cases effectively? Because if we can, then we preserve the freedom of folks to live both in dense urban areas and also in some of these more rural communities. So in other words, it all comes down to our ability to get access to data in real time and then respond in kind to the insights that we're able to glean from the data. Now, another sort of application that I want to spend some time talking about is in terms of delivery of government services. So earlier I mentioned that there's some role for governments in being a trusted resource or platform. And some of these trends around the decentralization of social networks into more defined affinity groups also means there's an opportunity there for local government in particular. And as we think about what that trend looks like, there are a couple of examples both at the city level and the nation state level, nationally and internationally. And I wanted to spend a minute talking about Tel Aviv in Israel. They launched a program called Digitel about 7 years ago or so, and it's essentially an affinity program for residents. They have about 60% of the population that has voluntarily opted into the program, and it started with essentially just a basic database where the government would reach out to folks and say, hey, we realize, say you have an affinity for shopping at local businesses. Well, it turns out that your neighborhood association or business district has these types of businesses that you might want to take a look at, and they're doing a discount at this particular time. We as the government actually have coupons or discounted vouchers that we can provide you to go check it out as an additional incentive. Or, hey, you own a pet, it's registered with the city, we know that, and by the way, there's a dog walking group that meets on Saturdays in your neighborhood. And so with these types of interactions, the residents started over time to say, hey, I trust the government to look out for me and proactively reach out and say, here's some valuable information that I might want to take advantage of. It either helps me save some money through discounts or learn about a valuable service that might be nearby. And so now they've got 60% of the residents in the program. So it's an amazingly powerful marketing database. And so the government's leveraged that to achieve policy outcomes, like, for example, making sure that socioeconomically disadvantaged folks who might have well, they can go attend it if it turns out that, say, there's unsold seats in the theater. Those theater owners are getting new revenue by having the city sell the seats, even at a 50% discount, to economically disadvantaged residents. Those residents, in turn, are able to get access to a theater where they wouldn't be able to before, when the price of the ticket was too high. So the government gets to check the box in terms of a social equity goal. Theater owner gets additional revenue. Everyone wins. And I think there's some lessons learned there. It's almost like a next door and Groupon on steroids, and it was built by the government. So they also don't sell the data. They don't let third parties get access to it. And that element of trust, both in proactively reaching out as though it's a customer success function, as well as retaining control over the data and not sharing it, are things that have really benefited the success of the program and its adoption rate. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about Estonia. So they have an e-identity program that they launched over about 10 to 15 years, really. If you think about the policies and the technology infrastructure, E-Road is what it's called, that was built to underpin this. And the idea is that any resident can sign up, but also people who are located outside of Estonia. And the idea here initially was that there are certain small business owners and entrepreneurs and other communities outside of Estonia that might want to take advantage of the more stable banking system and get access to some of the services that the government of Estonia provides. And with the government facing a declining population in terms of birth rates, they said, hey, if we're going to survive as a company, get access to fees and taxes, we might as well reach a broader audience. And so they've effectively turned it into almost a government as platform model, where it's like a SaaS-based company, software as a service, going out and reaching customers where they are with a subscription model. It's similar to what Estonia has done. They're reaching populations that want access to Estonia, and as long as they meet those requirements, they're able to take advantage of the government services. And it really underpins, I think, also the importance of policy in this. So in Tel Aviv, there's a separate initiative from Digitel that's going on where they actually have some smart city test beds that are designated. It's like a campus-like setting, and there are certain opportunities for companies to deploy technology in smaller scale pilots, and if it's successful, it then gets deployed fast-tracked throughout the city. There's relaxation or sort of on-ramp of some permitting opportunities. And there's also the involvement directly of the mayor and the local government alongside some private sector contributors, and it's all orchestrated through a nonprofit. And interestingly enough, when I talked to the guy who runs the nonprofit, I asked if there were any policy innovations going on alongside the technology deployments, and he said no. We believe that the community should not necessarily be invited into this process, and that it's much faster just to deploy the technology really fast if it works in an environment. And I think in places like Oregon in particular, you have a different sort of set of political expectations on the part of the community, where they want to be involved in the process, rightly so, and want to be able to help identify some of the needs that exist, some of the concerns that they may have, and see if the technology, if piloted and deployed, really results in negative consequences or produces some positive outcomes. And it's a little bit more of a give and take, and potentially a messier sort of process, but ultimately the outcome is far greater, especially where the goal of government is to serve residents, not just to deploy technology as quickly as possible. And so I think there are some lessons there for what Estonia did in a policy context, because they said, all right, just deploying this technology is going to potentially have some issues as it relates to data privacy and security, predominantly being in the part of the world in which they are. And so they said, all right, what are some ways that we can make it easier for people to control their data? And so what they did was they implemented some policies in the early 2000s that enabled ownership to reside in the individual, and the government served as a sort of clearinghouse with a decentralized database, essentially, using blockchain technology. And the idea is that a network, the government maintains a centralized identity that is essentially a string of numbers associated with that person. The government manages the identity, and then a bunch of different databases within the government, as well as with private sector partners like the banking system, have pieces of data on individuals in a variety of different locations, databases, et cetera. The identity to be verified has to go through the centralized government network. But other than that, all the individual data is stored in a variety of different locations and must be pulled from all those various locations. So with the decentralized approach, much harder to kind of hack into and get access to the crown jewels of the data. And it's an interesting model that has since been adopted in other countries like Finland and Iceland. And now there's an international community, essentially of open source folks developing and supporting the eRoad platform. I wanted to next talk a little bit about this company that came across out of the UK about 4 years ago. They've actually done some work here in Oregon. They've got an interesting approach. It's essentially just embracing the Internet of Things and people's mobile devices being relatively ubiquitous to enable inanimate objects to be rendered smart. So one example is in Austin, Texas. They did a public art installation and helped make it interactive for residents that were going around so they could learn about and interact with the various sculptures and other art installations. And in the case of Oregon, there's opportunities to think about this, both in terms of COVID-19. So there's been some criticism of efforts locally where it's like, okay, has the local government been able to share information and meet people where they are in the community, given all the COVID-19 related info flowing out there from a variety of different sources? Could government be a trusted resource, and how might those communications reach people kind of where they are out in the community? And so this is one idea, is in something that Hello Lamppost is doing with London right now, is they're essentially putting a network of inanimate objects, making like street posts or whatever, essentially a smart kiosk, if you will. All someone needs to be doing is passing by their cell phone, and you can be able to access certain designated inanimate objects to get government information. And it's essentially a mesh network of sorts that's trusted and then deployed throughout the city, just without actually installing anything new or physical. It's essentially just using some very basic IoT. And the interesting thing is that in terms of Hello Lamppost, there's also opportunities to think about it from the standpoint of if the Oregon Zoo opens up again, you know, looking at opportunities to interact with some of the animals and families, just by essentially having a playful kind of virtualized environment that brings, again, the physical with the digital and gives you more information as you're moving about the physical world. And this is only one example of many different companies that are doing this type of stuff right now. And I also want to talk a little bit about the City of Independence, bringing it home to Oregon here. So City of Independence is an interesting case study. There are, you know, a few thousand people in Independence, 6,000 total if you include Monmouth. And it's relatively rural, just outside of Salem, about 15 minutes. And, you know, they've been doing a lot of work leveraging a municipally owned gigabit fiber network that goes to residences and homes to do a variety of different technology projects. And there's some of it, the stuff that they've done is, I think, instructive for what other governments are doing here as it relates to data. And if we go next to this slide, this is a project we did for several years in Portland with Greater Portland Inc. It's called the Greater Portland Tech Challenge. And it's the idea of taking government challenges or use cases and doing a reverse pitch where startups and other tech companies can kind of pitch back at the governments and say, hey, we think we could do some interesting work in solving your challenge. Here's what we can bring to bear in terms of capabilities. And they get together and they talk and they go off and do a pilot project together. Now, this is not a particularly new model. It's been done elsewhere around the US, but Independence leveraged it in a sense by advertising some different technology use cases that we then took and connected with a US program called the Global City Teams Challenge, which was created by NIST. And the idea there is, are there other networks globally, communities and companies? A company out of Italy that was part of the Flyware network in Europe actually came to the US and helped Independence do a real-time crowd management platform, leveraging a lot of real-time data as it relates to crowd movements, and then also managing their small army of volunteers. And again, this was an example of technology coming together in a way where the real-time data was able to geographically be used in a way to help provide more effective government services and provide greater public safety when the population swells to 30, 40,000 people around the 4th of July every year. The other thing is that we took that work and we said, all right, is there a way to kind of deconstruct a hackathon and make it more accessible to more people? And the idea being, if we spread it out over time, make it a little bit more asynchronous, there's more opportunities for people with families or day jobs to kind of connect and contribute to the development of new technology in service to community challenges. And so we identified one in the fall last year where we worked with communities of color, specifically organizations that serve them in the Portland area, and brought together a variety of technologists and students and local governments and developed technology for those communities. It was really successful. One group in particular ended up with 4 new pieces of technology that have since been deployed. And each of the groups that participated ended up with tech. We raised about $75,000 and distributed checks to the participating nonprofits as well. And it allowed them to access more technology. And this was a perfect example of cross-sector, public-private, nonprofit, and academic collaboration, each bringing different capabilities to the table. The government supported or funded these community-based orgs, and they needed more technology and more resources to reach more people effectively, thereby making the government investment even better and also reaching more people and having a bigger impact. This was recognized for an International Smart Cities Award for Community Engagement just this year at Smart Cities Connect. Haven't quite picked the award up yet because a conference like this one was also canceled. So it may happen later this year in December. They were unable to make it virtual, so not quite as agile as GIS in motion. So what we do have here is another great example of some frameworks that communities are using to leverage data more effectively and get it out into the hands of the community. This is an example of the next iteration, which is early April. We delivered a virtual design sprint focused on agricultural innovation in the Mid-Valley and Independence. We worked with local growers and local economic development entity there to identify use cases or challenges to help those growers get access more directly to consumers. They had a lot of data, but they couldn't actually leverage that data in a collective way to make their operations more efficient and also to get better direct access to consumers. So a lot of the technology solutions that were proposed resulted in those types of applications. Now, in the case of Eugene, they've got a couple of things going on that are interesting in that it's really focused on bridging the digital divide and doing so in a way that allows them to collaborate with other communities. So US Ignite is an example of a nonprofit nationally that brings communities together through shared best practices around smart cities and high-speed internet networks and a variety of other applications that are developed using that infrastructure. And so they've been a longtime partner with us and with the city of Eugene, developing applications, leveraging the community. And in fact, the city of Eugene pioneered sort of the original Tech for Good hackathon that we've since expanded upon with Hack for a Cause. It became the design sprint, breaking the code, and has since expanded further with what you just saw in Independence. And what's interesting about this work is that it allowed, for example, the development of an app that allows folks to test their internet speed and see where there are underserved areas. And then again, the more ubiquitous that this app is in individual households, the better ideas that the city of Eugene has in terms of where, through eWeb and other organizations, they can deploy more infrastructure, reach more people, help to bridge the digital divide, both through private sector partners as well as public. And so really, ultimately, the road to resilience is through a shared services model, through collaboration here. And this is where we'll highlight a couple of different examples of things that are going on nationally and locally. I've already highlighted a few. Obviously, US Ignite is one. Another is the Global City Teams Challenge through NIST and the Department of Homeland Security. This started about 6 years ago. But the idea is replicable, scalable, and sustainable models for collaborative incubation of IoT-based solutions across cities. And we have communities here in Oregon that have taken advantage of this work. And also, it's interesting to see that, again, that issue of trustworthiness, privacy, and security really are underpinning a lot of it. It has to be a first principle in the development of technology and policies relating to data and interoperability issues, and making sure that some of the IoT doesn't have unintended consequences that are negative for the communities in which it's being deployed. So some of the categories that NIST focuses on, obviously data is top of mind for a lot of these, and not dissimilar from some of the work that we're doing in the state: agriculture, public safety, public Wi-Fi, transportation, et cetera. And one of the big challenges to these projects, to be successful, there have to be lower barriers to entry and less transactional friction in getting startups that are under-resourced working with government. Some of the greatest innovation comes from small, nimble, agile, young companies. And in order to get them involved, there really need to be some different approaches to procurement. As you can see from this slide, Oregon is one of the rising areas recognized nationally for startups. So it's a great opportunity for us to leverage some of that, the local capabilities that reside here in the state. So one program is STIR out of the Bay Area. They've been doing work nationally. Jay Nath used to be the Chief Innovation Officer for the mayor for the city of San Francisco. He's involved with STIR. And the opportunities with that program are really to make it easier for government to work with startups through challenge-based procurement. There's a number of examples of things they've done at the state level as well with the state of California. They're helping to reform the procurement process and, again, make it easier for collaboration across public and private. In Portland, there's a work underway by the Smart City PDX group there within the city to create an urban data lake called Puddle that really, as a first order of magnitude, solves some of the interoperability issues and data standardization and sharing across bureaus internally. But really, a tremendous opportunity exists for any government, maybe it's Metro or some other entity, to essentially take what a data lake or data hub like that could potentially provide and extend it to more communities, smaller, medium-sized communities in the region, other local governments that have data that also operate here in the Portland area. And so I think an interesting vision would be, how can we start to build and deploy and support shared models where it could be the combination of the state of Oregon, city of Portland, smaller, medium-sized communities, developing, acquiring, and maintaining common infrastructure in a way that's more efficient than each of those communities trying to do it each independently, cuts across some of the interoperability issues and creates bigger, more interesting platforms for collaboration for private sector companies that want to get involved in developing and deploying apps. And I think that where this story ends is really something that it's kind of near where it began, in the sense that a lot of this work really depends on an interesting use case. Much like COVID-19 really has focused in a closer lens on resiliency and what it means for communities, for systems, for companies and organizations and households. It's really created a sense of urgency around adoption of more virtual environments, cut down on traffic, and had some interesting positive outcomes for environment. There are a number of things that struggle to be adopted up until now. And I think as well that what we're going to see is, as governments are facing situations where they have resource constraints coming out of the crisis, it's going to be an opportunity and a greater sense of urgency around collaboration and shared services and shared resources. And so I think there are going to be opportunities in how we collectively come together that are really interesting for purposes of some of these data platforms and where data is collected, and the development of policies that help to make sure that the sharing of data and its collection are done so with an eye toward the right types of data privacy frameworks in the United States. So the illusion I where we began is with some of the work that has gone on in Independence as it relates to agriculture. There's some interesting use cases there for the state of Oregon to potentially be collaborating with cities like Independence and smaller and medium-sized communities around the state. Because frankly, what we found from the Ag Innovation Challenge in Independence was that there's a lot of data that the Oregon Department of Agriculture has that growers already share with it. And so with that data already being there, it's just a matter of getting that data out to the growers in an aggregated way where it's not sort of able to be identifying individual farmers, but provides at the aggregate level a benchmark for how those individual farms are performing. And they can then use that data and insight to course correct in terms of how they're operating their farms, thereby making them more competitive and collectively helping them compete with other regions more effectively. So those are some of the examples in sort of really interesting ways that data and GIS is a practice, or helping to transform communities, help improve economies. And with that, I'll pause so we have enough time for Q&A. And that concludes my the formal part of my presentation, shall we say.
All right. Oh. Well, let's see. I have not gotten any questions yet from. So if anybody has any, they can type them in. I also, over in the participants window, you can raise your hand. There are some buttons over there that allow you to do a couple things. Raise a hand, there's check marks and some other icons you can use. If you raise your hand, I'll see if we can allow you to ask your question verbally. But it's just as valid to just type it into the question and answer window, and we can read it from there. Right now, you would be getting a lot of applause, I think, if we had been doing this all in person. That was a great overview. You wove in all the current affair stuff pretty well there at the beginning. Let's see. Well, I'll give everybody a couple of minutes to come up with some. Oh yeah, somebody was just asking if the presentation will be available later on. Yes, I'm recording it right now, so we're going to put this out on the Oregon ERISA website somewhere, either on the conference page or just directly on the Oregon ERISA page. And it should be in one form or another. This is going to become a file at the moment, and I'm not sure if we'll have an embedded player on the site or if the file will just be there. Off the top of my head, I don't have any direct questions. I found some of those, some of the ones like the one in Israel to be very interesting.
It's really fascinating for sure. We had a chance to meet with the person behind it. He's been there consistently since the beginning. His name's Zohar Sharon, and he's been over here to Oregon a couple of times, most recently last spring. And he met with the Portland mayor and a couple other folks. And this idea of sort of government being more proactive, using data in ways to delight and inform people is, I think, an interesting model, right? Because people get into public service initially to help and connect with people in a positive way. But oftentimes, and I can say this having been in government, you feel like you're under the gun. You're constantly in reactive mode, just kind of processing requests, customer support tickets, et cetera, that are coming in at you from all different directions. And so it's kind of an interesting approach where if you're out there proactively getting ahead of the game, so to speak, you're also building trust and a positive view of government in a way that oftentimes people are left kind of scratching their heads when they're like, oh, well, I complained to the government about something or I had to pay a fine, but I don't know what the status of it is. But if you just share information back out and say, thank you for your request, it's in the queue, we'll get to it, here's why it's taking a while, or even better, proactively be able to connect with people. And it's not even a negative interaction. It's just, hey, I've got some information that might be valuable for you. Here's how it might improve your life. It's sad, but that's kind of an unusual communication from government.
Right. Lauren, you want to read the questions that are coming in?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Skip, for the wonderful presentation.
Experiences with some of these proactive ones, it starts to get to an interesting sort of relationship.
Skip, so Teresa asks, what is the time horizon for the various new technologies to come online, such as the Internet of Things lamppost? Are there geographic trends beyond the political trends for adoption?
Yep.
Like contact tracing?
Yeah, for sure. So with Hello Lamppost, for example, they're deploying all over the world and have been for several years now. In the U.S., I mentioned Austin, where they did a project. I think they've been talking to the Oregon Zoo a bit. This is, of course, before the crisis. And I believe as well that they've recently started to do some work with the Digital City Testbed here, which is a part of Portland State University and in Vancouver, British Columbia, University of British Columbia. And so UBC and PSU are serving as different test beds for the deployment of technology, largely around access and mobility. And so I know that the PSU program is in touch with the city of Portland about some different ways that the Hello Lamppost system could be deployed in Portland for a variety of different use cases.
That is so cool. Okay, great. We have one more question. I think this is from Sarah
Sandy.
Gruber.
That's
for
Sandy.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Thank you. Who usually begins the process of working with government and other GIS users to make these cooperative groups happen? So what's the instigator most often?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that what I've seen from a variety of the different collaborative projects that go on is it could come from a number of cases or a number of places, really. In some cases, there's a close relationship between an academic institution and government. Like in the case of Portland, PSU is a very close collaborator. Oftentimes, ideas for projects and things can flow from the university to the city. When I was at the city of Portland, we found that there were a lot of instances where it would come from political pressure or a lot of communications from residents. And so that's been a sort of a common source historically is if residents are clamoring for something, the government may, kind of force its hand or adopt it willingly and embrace it. You look at rideshare, caused some consternation when some of the ride sharing companies decided that they would go into cities and start with constituents, get them excited about the application, and government's like, whoa, a little too much too fast. But by then it was just a tidal wave of residents clamoring for the service, and so it becomes more of an antagonistic approach that way. You can contrast that with the approach taken with scooter deployment, which is a little bit more proactive in reaching out to the city of Portland and saying, hey, how about we do a pilot together and learn from the data? And so there's a number of different ways that this happens. Sometimes it's a business, other times it's pressure from residents, other times it could be an academic research institution that's got a close relationship with the city. But I think ultimately a lot of them are successful because of the ability to be a little bit more nimble and agile. And it's often tough for government and its structure to do that, especially when it comes to technology development and deployment. And so what we're seeing is there are some examples of different organizations that have been created to serve as sort of a bridge of sorts. In some cases, it's nonprofits that are created to do this type of work. Even in the context of data, there are some examples of different governments trying to create data trusts that would be essentially nonprofit entities that reside outside of government and could help to kind of manage and bring together both public and private sources of data. So there's some interesting possibilities there, and I don't think any one model has necessarily solved it to such a great degree that it's become the gold standard. But I think we're going to see a lot more of this type of experimentation in terms of organizational design in the coming years.
Excellent, thank you. Does anyone have any more questions? Oh, we got one more from Debbie. Are you aware of local GIS efforts responding to COVID-19, which have urgent need for volunteers?
That is a good question. I know that they're looking for folks to go out and do the contact tracing, which is a bit more manual and less technical. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know for certain, but I do know some of the folks in the governor's office that are helping to kind of coordinate some of these efforts. So feel free to reach out, any of the folks who listened, and if they have questions about anything that I covered or something related, my email address is just skip.newberry@techoregon.org.
Okay, I'm gonna kind of close it out. It's 1 o'clock, and I'm sure everybody wants to get back to work from their lunch hour. The chat window has many congratulations for Skip, or that's about as good as applause as we're going to get, I think. If you thank you very much, Skip, for your time, and thank you for the interesting topic that you brought to us. And that's it. Thanks very much, everyone. Hope to see you next time. We have another podcast coming up on the 27th. It'll be Nate Sandell, the Director of Education at Columbia River Maritime Museum, on his boat project that he did. It's actually really, really interesting, and I hope everybody will come by. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.